Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It is a gloomy Tuesday here in Portugal. Yes, it is trying to rain. I hope it does. It's rained a little bit off and on the last couple of days, but we need lots and lots of rain. I even walked to the office just in the hopes that it would rain because I have no car. So let's see if my plan works, and it really does rain. That's the way my Tuesday is going. I hope that your week is going well so far. They had a good weekend. Our weekend, let's see. So the last of our friends not finally. That sounds pejorative. No, the last of our friends left. I just say finally because we've had visitors kind of nonstop since February 22nd. And so it's been a lot. And we've loved having people over, but as I've shared, it's been a little crazy and hectic. So they left on Friday. We did have a birthday party on Saturday. It was some friends of my husband's that he knows from a poker group. He goes and plays poker with a group of guys. So I hadn't met any of these folks except for the person whose birthday we were celebrating. He is the founder, the creator of the poker group, and so I'd met him briefly, but I hadn't met anyone else. So lots of new people, some pretty cool people, and actually I told a couple of them, I'm so bad at self-promotion, I told them a couple of them about the podcast, and they said they were going to listen, which, hi, if you're listening, but also why? You know me, I've said this before, I put this out thinking, yeah, it's better if I put this out thinking no one listens to it because it's better for my brain, right? I know people listen to it, but when I actually talk to people who want to listen to it or who have listened to it, my brain sort of melts down. So that was weird, but hi, new friends. If you are actually listening, it was wonderful to meet you. At any rate, that was Saturday. Sunday, we just took it easy. It was quiet, had a very peaceful day, and then, now here we are in the week, and it's trying to rain, and I hope it does. At any rate, that is not what we're here to talk about. We are here to talk about today's author interview, and today I am speaking with author Elisa Bernick about her memoir. It is called Departure Stories, Betty Crocker Made Matzo Balls and Other Lies, which is just the title alone makes you want to find out what the heck this is about. Well, it is about Elisa Bernick growing up different. That's in quotes. That's the way the description of the book starts. Elisa Bernick grew up, quote unquote, different, i.e. Jewish, in the white Christian suburb of New Hope, Minnesota during the 1960s and early 1970s. At the center of her world was her mother, Arlene, who was a foul-mouthed, red-headed suburban Samson who ultimately shook the walls of their family until it collapsed. Poignant and provocative, Departure Stories peers through the broader lens of Minnesota's recent history to reveal an intergenerational journey through trauma that unraveled the Bernick family and many others. Deftly interweaving reporting, archival material, memoir, jokes, scrapbook fragments, commentary, and one very special Waikiki meatballs recipe, Bernick explores how the invisible baggage of place and memory, Minnesota's uniquely anti-Semitic history, and the cultural shifts of feminism and changing marital expectations contributed to her family's eventual implosion. So this is a memoir, as it said. It is about her growing up in Minnesota, and we talk a little bit about this later, that and I've mentioned here before that my mom's family is Scandinavian Lutheran, and we did not grow up. I did not grow up in Minnesota, but Montana is... The Scandinavian Lutheran kind of carries over a lot of places. It's not quite the same as the Minnesota culture, but I know a lot about the Minnesota culture, that Scandinavian Lutheran Minnesota culture that's so prevalent. If you've ever watched the show Fargo, you know the accent. And it's just crazy. And I've also talked a little bit on this podcast before how connections always amaze me, especially with how far out my author interviews get scheduled. So I'm reading this book this week, the memoir, and I just happened to be listening to a book, an Audible original book, obviously on audiobook, that a friend recommended, and it is about a Minnesota Lutheran growing up in a small town in Minnesota, and literally less than a minute into the audiobook, the main character's mother says, "Oofta," and references a hot dish casserole. So it was just, the connections are cracking me up. But that is that very prevalent Minnesota culture that is a bit of a stereotype, but also, I worked with people at summer camp who were from Minnesota, and they were very much like some of the characters in the audiobook that I'm listening to. But I can only imagine, and now I have a better understanding of what I could have imagined growing up as different in that culture would be, because different is not necessarily good in a culture that doesn't always like change. And Elisa does a really good job of describing that culture, that reticence, that kind of fear of difference. Not far into the book, I highlighted a paragraph. She's talking about Minnesota Nice. You've maybe heard of it. Minnesota Nice people are genuinely nice, but they cover up things that aren't so nice with a lot of passive aggressive. And so the word interesting and different in Minnesota, not always a good thing. But she says the Minnesota Nice is also marked by a high degree of reserve, an aversion to confrontation and outward quote unquote unpleasantness, a certain amount of self-deprecation paired with a strong disinclination to stand out or appear different from the norm, a marked discomfort with strong displays of feeling or emotion. That is my Minnesota or my Scandinavian Lutheran family. That self-deprecation drives my husband crazy. He talks about how I cannot take a compliment, how I can't compliment myself. Yep. The disinclination to stand out or appear different from the norm. Yep. And compliments not easily given or accepted in my family. And then a marked discomfort with strong displays of feeling or emotion. Now, I will give my parents credit that they did much, much better with this than their parents did. My grandmother, the Scandinavian Lutheran one, never said I love you, even when we said it to her. She, okay, bye grandma, love you, talking to her on the phone, love you, and she'd just say, Totally, that paragraph just spoke to my soul. But this is not about me. That was just me kind of putting things into the context of me reading it. And you don't always have books that really hit you like that. But then to read about growing up Jewish, and less than 2% of the population then and now is Jewish in Minnesota, so it's not a large population. So you can imagine that would be a different way of growing up in a very homogenous culture, and that's what this book talks about in part. So let's go ahead and turn to the interview. Again, the book is called Departure Stories. Betty Crocker Made Matzo Balls and Other Lies, and the author is Elisa Bernick. Hi, Elisa. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
I am excited to have you here. I'm looking forward to talking about your memoir, Departure Stories. Betty Crocker Made Matzo Balls and Other Lies, which I love the title, first off.
Thank you.
But before we get to the actual memoir, if you could start by sharing just a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm a lifelong resident, although I've exited for periods of time, but I am back here. I have 2 adult kids in their 20s. I am a veteran journalist. I began as a public radio reporter for quite a few years, then switched over to long form television documentary journalism. I was a documentary journalist for 12 years. And then for the last part of my career here, I've been in print. And I'm currently a magazine journalist. So I edit 2 international textile magazines. That's my day job. And as we speak, I'll point out why that became important as I kind of delved into my writing life as a memoirist.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I'm looking forward to that. So again, the memoir Departure Stories. Can you give an overview of the book?
Yeah. So essentially, I use my family's story to explore a few very large topics and then many smaller topics too. But generally, I look at the anti-Semitism that I didn't know about till I was researching this book, that was so prevalent in the Twin Cities and in Minneapolis in particular when my parents were growing up. My family arrived here at the turn of the last century, and I just didn't realize what the environment was for them. So that's one thing. The second thing is my mother came of age in terms of her adulthood and her marriage and having children in the 1950s and 60s, at a time when women's identities were really being called into question, second wave feminism, and then the effects of that on marriage. And that was sort of the start of the giant divorce boom, and then what that did to our family. So those are sort of the larger issues, and all of it is in service of a discussion about stories and how stories form our identity and how stories can work on so many levels, but often we're not aware of the stories we're telling, and that by becoming aware of them, we can actually create stories that serve our lives better. So that's the general foundation of this memoir.
Yeah, and you bring up 2 really good examples of stories and memory and how memory can help or hinder the creation of stories. Both of them running away. One story that you remember that may or may not have happened, and one story that you don't particularly remember that actually did happen. So can you talk a little bit about memory and how that plays into the overarching theme of the book?
Yes, and memory, well, obviously as a memoirist, right? That I'm peddling in memories. But as it turns out, memory is a very fascinating, complicated, not very well understood. It's understanding the brain science behind memory is something that many scientists are working on right now. And everything we learn both complicates and intensifies the idea of memory. So, I started this book initially as a novel. Okay. And so this is something memoirists do quite frequently when we're not ready to sort of plumb the depths of the real stuff, right? It's a little bit of a way of distancing ourselves from some of the most difficult things that eventually you're kind of forced into if you want to have a successful memoir. But it did have its genesis as a novel. And I, at one point, wrote a story for the novel that I thought I was making up out of whole cloth. And this is what you were alluding to. And I had my sister Lori read this. And when I gave it to her to read, I said, so does this seem like something a 13-year-old could do? And the story was that a 13-year-old girl at night hitchhiked to LAX. Okay. And Lori read it and said, well, I don't know if every 13-year-old girl could do this, but you did. So I guess some 13-year-old girls could. And my mind, I just went, wait, what? I did this? And she said, well, how do you think you got to LAX? So here I knew I had gotten to LAX as a 13-year-old girl many years ago, right? When I was 13. And I'm in my 60s now. So these memories are old, but I didn't remember that I'd actually hitchhiked to LAX. I truly thought I was making this up, that this was fiction. And that's one way that this idea of memory kind of blew my mind, and I had to start investigating it. And then, of course, when we're writing a memoir, you're peddling in memories, as I mentioned, and trying to remember this is a huge discussion among memoirs, right? How do we authentically tell our memories when, of course, I can't remember what was said around the kitchen table when I was 7 years old, word for word? Of course, nobody can. So really investigating and understanding for myself and being very clear with my readers about how much am I making up here? How much is real? And how much does that actually matter? And I really discuss this right away in my book. It's the second chapter in the book, and it's called Memory is a Slippery Fish, where I do delve into some of the brain science and create expectations for my readers around that.
I'm going to jump in here so we can take our first break of this episode, but keep this conversation in mind. Keep it in your memory. It's a conversation about memory. Remember this conversation because we are going to jump back into this conversation when we come back from the break. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Elisa Bernick about her memoir, Departure Stories. Let's return to that interview. And as a reminder, you were supposed to remember memory, right? We were talking about memory is a slippery fish in that chapter and what it means to write a memoir when you don't always remember perfectly exact details. Back to the interview. Yeah, and then you just flat out say, here's a conversation that happened in general, but I'm plumping up the details of those specific words that were said.
I do. And that word plumping is a really important piece of this because one book that I quite appreciate is Tell It Slant, by, let me get the writers' names correct here, Brenda Miller and Suzanne Paola. And the way they discuss they're memoir teachers. And they talk a lot in their book about getting at the truth, the emotional truth of our memories. So don't get hung up on word for word stuff. And, I think their line is, and I don't have my book open in front of me, but it's something like plumping the truth with the imagination. Okay. So I'm hanging. I have a real skeleton of memories, right? That's the foundational backbone of the book. But imagination and truth come together in memory, and science bears this out. And there's a reason for that. That's what I discovered as I was really putting my journalist hat on and delving into the science of the brain, is the reason that memory is fused with imagination is it's so important for the flexibility of memory to be there. It's a survival mechanism. As our life circumstances change, our brain makes it possible for us to change with it, to be very adaptable to that change. And I'm a Jewish, my ancestors were Jewish refugees to Minnesota. And that was a really important exploration for me in this book. And how did that affect my family? How does that affect me? How does that affect my children? Sort of getting at that intergenerational memory and some of that trauma that comes along there. But discovering that memory is flexible by design was like so important for me to think about. You know, if you've been a population of people who have had trauma in your lives for hundreds upon hundreds of years, doesn't it make sense that your survival mechanisms would be built on this flexible notion of memory and story and imagination? And that just is such an important part. It gets at that storytelling piece and how stories can save our lives, essentially.
And it goes even deeper because you talk about the research that's being done into epigenetic memory and how it's potential that memories in some ways are stored in our DNA. So that those memories of persecution and fleeing and everything else that is involved in Jewish history can somehow be passed down through the DNA. So you have an understanding even before you realize it.
Exactly. So you're not necessarily conscious to all of the things that are in your DNA. And I do not profess to be a scientist. So my understanding of epigenetics is about, an inch deep and 6 yards wide. So let's just establish that. But my understanding is that there are a lot of things passed along to us in our DNA and that our environmental circumstances can switch on, can activate certain genes. And so they've done all this research into, for example, the survivors of people who were part of the Holocaust. Those descendants might have certain genes. They have a propensity to have them switched on, so their reaction to certain environmental conditions would be different from people who are not survivors, for example. And this applies to many different sorts of people. There's so much trauma, large and small, that are part of our DNA that we're not aware of. But becoming aware of that and how our stories react, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we're not aware that we're telling ourselves, those are really important avenues and opportunities for overcoming some of that unconscious intergenerational trauma.
So what then, because you mentioned that this started out as a novel, what then prompted you, after the conversation with your sister, but what prompted you to write this specific memoir?
Okay, so I wrote it as a novel. I searched for an agent for about a year, no takers. And then I discovered this very cool national program called, and it's sponsored by AWP, the American Writers Program, called Writer to Writer. And you can submit a manuscript. And if it's selected, you get an opportunity to work with a mentor, a published writer, who will help look at your manuscript with an eye toward helping you get it published. Okay. I won this opportunity. It was fantastic. I worked with a California writer called Leslie Schwartz, and we got to page 100 of my novel. And she said, well, Elisa, you're a very good writer, but unless there's a murder, a suicide, or a drug overdose in the next 25 pages, this is not a novel. It's a memoir, and you need to write it like a memoir. Oh, wow. I was just like, oh, man. Oh, I've been trying to avoid this. But, but I did, I knew it in my heart. I knew she was right. And also she said, now I should just fess up right at the start. The reason why I was avoiding writing this as a memoir is because I came from a very difficult, dysfunctional family. And in particular, my mother was a very abusive person, both physically and verbally and psychologically abusive. And for my entire life and the life of my siblings, we had been telling a one-note story about her, that she was a narcissistic, abusive mother. And by doing that, by spending my entire life telling this one-note story, I had locked her and myself in a cage where she was tormentor, I was victim. And that that's the extent of our story. It was no deeper than that. And Leslie Schwartz, my mentor, said, and listen, by the way, Elisa, I can't stand to be in the room with the mother in your novel for another second. And she made me realize, why would any reader be interested in that, in reading that and spending the amount of time you do in a book with someone like that? And in order to find the nuance, the resonance, the interest, the creativity, I had to open the cage, put my journalist hat on, and start asking questions about, why was my mom so angry all the time? What was going on in her life? What was the larger context? What was going on in Minnesota? What was going on in the world? How was it to be her getting married, raising children during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? And by doing that, by stepping outside of that very limited, nasty little story that I had been telling, that my siblings had been telling, I was really able to open it up and find the broader, creative, interesting story in that. And it was such a gift to me, to my mom, to my kids, to my siblings, to do that. That was the great gift for me of writing this as a memoir.
And I would imagine then that that's the lens that you use to then choose the specific details and stories that you share within the memoir. How difficult was that process?
And that's a super interesting point. And I'm glad you raised it, because sometimes when people write a memoir, they think, well, I'm just going to tell it all, right? Whatever all might be. But really, and this is where craft plays a part. A memoir is a very carefully curated lens, as you say, of a very specific and carefully chosen group of stories or story. And what falls out of the book is as important as what stays in. And that's why it takes so many drafts to get to the final product. And for me, it took a while to figure out, well, wait a minute, what is the story I want to tell? And as I mentioned, the real story here was, I grew up in this terribly difficult family. Here's some context about what was going on. Here's some of the harrowing things that happened, but here's how these harrowing things allowed me to suddenly realize I'm a character in my mom's story. I think it's time to author my own story. So here's how she survived what I was handed, unfortunately, but here's how I'm going to use what I was handed to survive my own life and become the person I am now.
Which is fascinating when you think about it. It is now time for our second break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking more about Minnesota, about the culture of Minnesota. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Elisa Bernick. I want to talk about Minnesota a little bit as maybe a character, because for me, this book was really interesting. My mom is Scandinavian Lutheran. We grew up in Montana, but I know I worked with people from Minnesota, at the Lutheran Bible camp that I worked at growing up or in college. But my dad's family, Russian Jewish. Now somewhere in there, one of my dad's ancestors married a Catholic person. All the Mecklers in Montana are Catholic, and then my dad married my mom. So the Scandinavian Lutheran part is really the main focus for my growing up experiences. Didn't really talk about my dad's family that much. So this was really interesting, and I felt almost like I was having a bit of an identity crisis when reading it because of these two parts of my history.
Yeah.
But all that is to say that Scandinavian Lutheran is really predominant in Minnesota.
Oh,
and
yes.
Your family did not fit that mold, and we don't like change. We Scandinavian Lutherans, I can tell you, we don't like things that are different or change. And you mentioned this in your book. So talk about that as part of the book, but also talk about the fact that you still live there and how that's changed for you.
Yeah. So, and you're absolutely right. So this, Minnesota as a state was largely early on, once the native inhabitants were, like everywhere in the United States, warred against and basically moved off their land. The Lutherans, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Danes, they were really the ones to settle Minnesota. And basically it's because they came from a harsh climate. So they were coming to a climate that was nothing new for them. This was familiar territory. Plus there were other settlers who sent missives back to the Norwegian land saying, hey, this, here you can practice your religion freely. Of course, this was if you were a white person, non-native, right? I mean, this was just part of the white settler story, as was the case across the United States. But in particular, it was those Lutheran populations. And they brought with them a very sort of egalitarian, civic-minded sensibility. But as you mentioned, difference was not part of that identity. It was sort of everybody being the same and voicing the same opinion. And if you didn't share the same opinion, you were quiet. Well, of course, that's not how Jews were. And in researching this book, I did not know, despite the fact being Jewish, and I mentioned this earlier, that the Twin Cities were such a hotbed of anti-Semitism. And it does come out of the sense of don't be different. And I grew up, like many Jews, hearing, hey, you're Jewish? You don't look Jewish, which was meant to be a compliment, I think. Right? But for me, hearing
backhanded passive-aggressive compliment, which we're really good at.
Passive-aggressive compliment, indeed, because, I realized only as I was writing this book, so only as an adult, that was saying to me, you don't look like what you are, and good. That's a good thing because what you are then is bad, right? But I didn't hear that growing up, and I'm not married to a Jewish person, and my husband says, well, they didn't mean that poorly. They just meant they don't know much about Jews. And I thought, yeah, maybe, except now that I've discovered how anti-Semitic Minneapolis was in the 1940s. In fact, it was considered the most anti-Semitic city in the entire country in the 1940s. I don't think that was such an innocent comment. And this, there were the silver shirts, they were called, a white supremacist group, had one of its largest chapters here in the Twin Cities and in outstate Minnesota. So I'm just not sure how innocent all of those comments were. But by the time we moved out to the suburbs, so we grew up in New Hope, Minnesota, and we moved there in 1965. By then, after World War II, Jews were considered white enough to take advantage of all the financial opportunities given white people during that time. But people of color were not allowed to take advantage of those. So they stayed in the central cities while white people moved to the suburbs. But because of that, because no people of color were allowed out to the suburbs, Jews were as different as you got. So even though anti-Semitism had moved largely underground, when it erupted, because anti-Semitism is everywhere. And I went along thinking, I was just like everybody else. All my friends were not Jewish. We were one of the few Jewish families around me. And my older brother and I were the only Jews in our schools. And so I just sort of, and I talk about this in the book, grew up all one word, feeling like Jewish, not Christian, like all one word, right? That's how my identity felt until, and there were a series of anti-Semitic incidents when I was about 7 that happened to my brother and myself, like our neighbor screaming at us and calling us dirty Jews, right? Suddenly I had a different reaction. Then I thought, oh, I'm Jewish, not Christian, but that's a big difference, because being Jewish means I'm bad, and I'm going to hide that identity. So starting that young, having to kind of hide and diminish my identity, it is only through the writing of this memoir that I realized what an impact that had on me, that disconnection from my own identity. And it's interesting that you say, Sarah, that your dad was Jewish, but then there was Catholicism that happened. That is a really common story for Jewish people, because of course, that's the avenue to success, was not being Jewish, but was switching, right? Was converting to Catholicism or a different religion. And I've talked to many people who have found, thanks to 23andMe and other, these other services, hey, I just realized my family's Jewish. Way back, right? Yeah. And then they converted. Yeah, because it's really hard to be an outcast and be different and othered.
Yeah, it is. Exactly. And I don't know my family story. I don't know when that happened or how. It would be interesting to try to dig into that further. But how is it now that you as a kid, you knew a little bit, but it wasn't as maybe overt as you were aware of? How is it different as an adult living in Minnesota, or how is that now?
Like everywhere, Minnesota's come a long way in its consciousness of its legacy. Minnesota has a particularly disgraceful legacy when it comes to housing covenants, in particular, that prevented people of color from purchasing homes in most neighborhoods in the Twin Cities and in Duluth and Rochester. And these have really come to light, and there have been efforts to take charge. I just will tell you, for listeners who may not be aware of this, but Minnesota has the lowest incidence of home ownership among people of color in the entire country. That's the legacy of those housing covenants, and the greatest education gap in, white people versus people of color being the graduation rates from high school, that sort of thing. This goes way back to that legacy that Jews also suffered from. So it's part of a larger story. But now that story is being told. I keep coming back to this word, talking about stories, because that's where truth is. And the more stories come to light that are uncovered, the more then that you can set it in front of you and say, hey, this is what's going on. Let's decide how to deal with it. So that is what's happening. I have felt for example, I live in St. Paul now, in what used to be a very Jewish area, then was for many years a very Catholic area, which is what it is now. But my neighbor, when I moved in here across the street in 1986, my neighbor said, hey, you're the first Jews I've ever met. I was 26 years old and still hearing that.
Wow.
You are the first Jewish people I've ever met. and they belong to a very Catholic community that is my neighborhood. And so that was a little startling to still hear that in my mid-20s. But then I had to think, well, why is that startling? There aren't that many Jews. When my parents were coming up here in the 1930s and 40s, Jews were about 1.7% of the population here in the Twin Cities. That is the same percentage of Jews now. So, it's made me very thoughtful. It's made me thoughtful about talking to my kids about this stuff. They've learned a ton through my process of researching this book. My family members have learned a ton. We've had lots of interesting conversations. None of us married Jewish people. That's kind of interesting. And my siblings I'm talking about. So that's kind of interesting. And I recently, just a couple days ago, gave a talk on my book to a very large Jewish audience. There were 130 people there. I'd say they were predominantly Jews. That's the first time I've done that. And there was a rabbi there, and she talked a lot about the legacy that Jews carry from the intellectualism of Jews that's been a schism between the head and the heart, and how Jews have to reclaim the emotional connection to their Judaism. Like your dad, there were really good, reasonable, logical steps that people could take to make sure that their difference didn't mean they couldn't take advantage of all the wonderful things that white people could take advantage of. But now we can be all sorts of different kinds of difference and still take advantage, or we should be able to, of the success that white people have had all these years. So I think the whole Jewish story just is part of that larger story.
Right. A larger and much more nuanced and layered story. Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what do you hope readers will take away from the book?
One of the main messages is to become aware of the stories we are telling, that you may be unconscious to, because as we were talking about, they may be part of your DNA, that it just sort of unconscious ways that you think about your family, think about people in your life, maybe a negative story. I've heard from a lot of readers who have had difficult relationships with their parents, with their mothers in particular, because a lot of my readership has been female. And that to enrich your story, to sort of open up doors and make your relationship possibly larger with your mom, with your parents, to allow your kids to have a richer relationship with their family members, with their grandparents, that you can reinvent your memories. Now, this is going to sound a little weird, but I take you back to the fact that the truth around memories is really an emotional truth. And every time we remember something, we're not remembering the initial event. We're remembering the last time we remembered that event. And every time you bring up that memory, you tweak it a little bit by what's going on in the present day. And then you tuck it back in your head and it goes back into your cells, and then you raise it again. So there's an opportunity every single time you talk about, think about, tell a story about a memory, to make it something that serves you better. And that I guess is the main message here. In coming to terms with an abusive parent, I surrendered a story that no longer served me or my mom or my larger family. And in surrendering that memory, I could reinvent a different story that served us all better. So that now when I think of my mom, and she has passed, it is a richer story. It is a far more nuanced story. that involves genuine fondness, respect, grace. It's just allowed for my family to talk about my mom in a larger context, to understand the why, the where, the because. It's just delivered, I would say, a gift to all of us, the gift of a larger story. That's the main message here.
Yeah, which is amazing. That's great. Okay, time for our final break of this episode. When we come back, we'll find out if Elisa is planning on returning to the world of memoir, and is she going to write another one? Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Elisa Bernick. Will you write another memoir, do you think?
Yes, I think I will. What's come out of this for me is, well, I've really been intrigued by the notion of resilience. Why do some people have the ability to go through traumatic things and find a way through, find that they can use the trauma to enrich their lives somehow, and some cannot. So that's something that I'm exploring further. Of course, we've been speaking so much in our time together about memory. And every single time I pick up a book about memory, I discover that they've learned something new and fascinating about it. So that is so intriguing. Memory is just an amazing thing. The brain is an amazing thing. And the other thing is memoir. You can write so many different memoirs in your life because every time you look back, you are different. And you bring a different perspective to your own life and to your own story. So there is so much that fell out of my book, so many stories. And I should mention that I've written this as, these are tiny little chapters, and I tell a lot of stories. Like, I use a lot of dialogue. Yeah, I really bring you into the story and you are there, sort of thing. So many of those stories are still, waiting to be told. So I'm excited about that. Yeah, I think I will.
Well, and even, not that I'm saying that you would do this, but even if you told the same time frame, but from a different lens, the lens of your relationship with your father more specifically, or something else, that's the amazing thing about memoirs, is there's so many different avenues.
Absolutely. And I've read several memoirs by the same person, and that is exactly what they have learned and what I have learned from reading those. And I love memoir because it's as a person, the way I learned is through writing. So if I'm curious about something, I need to write about it to learn about it. And this just seems to be a natural way for me to move through my own life, is to examine my own story. And I found when I was writing, I never knew this till I was writing this particular book, that I talk out loud when I write. And every once in a while I would stop writing and hear the sound of my voice ringing in my living room. And I was thinking, wow, have I been talking for 3 hours out loud? I'm not sure.
That's funny.
Not sure. But yeah, it's just kind of comical. But apparently that is the way that I learn about things, is by writing about them. And that's common for a lot of writers. And I'm a journalist. So of course I'm a research hound. And I love delving into all this stuff. So, and I did, by the way, write another book I'd like to mention. It's called The Family Sabbatical Handbook, The Budget Guide to Living Abroad with Your Family. And I wrote it quite some time ago, but it is, it explores the time that my husband and I moved with our two young kids. Our kids were 2 and 7 when we moved to Mexico and lived for nearly 2 years. And we didn't know anybody. And this was long before you could work remotely. This was back in 2002, that long ago. And it's just kind of a travelogue memoir of that experience for our family. So folks could look that one up too.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. In terms of writing, you obviously have written in a lot of capacities throughout your life and professional career. What prompted you to want to write for publication?
Oh, whoa, that's a big question, Sarah.
You just break that down into a soundbite, if you will.
I think there is something wonderful about, for me, writing, as I said, is the way I get to know both myself and the world better. And I think that writing is a natural avenue toward connection. And the publication aspect, I will tell you that is not my priority. When I sit down to write, I don't actually think about that. What I'm thinking about is the project ahead of me. Whether or not it finds the light of day is secondary. And it's lovely to have something published. I have many, as you mentioned, many articles published. You can find a lot of my work online. The shorter work is, in my mind, a way for me to most immediately connect with my audience. I want to discuss something. I want to talk about something, share something. But the longer work, it's more a discussion with myself. So the publication of that is secondary. It's a lovely thing that it happens. And I'm so pleased to connect with you, and through you, your audience. I've been to many book clubs. Oh, it's so delightful to be a part of a book club and talk about how the books affected people. I love all of that, but it isn't my primary goal.
Yeah. And so from that perspective, then, if somebody came to you and said, yeah, I would like to write, do you have advice for someone who's thinking they might want to write, whether for themselves or for publication?
Well, obviously I want to say, please write. It's so important, because that's the way you identify all that unconscious stuff inside you. And it's just such a wonderful thing to discover that and create, again, that word connection with yourself. That's the primary means by which I think writers discover things. The other thing I would say, if it's memoir you're after, don't show your stuff too early to people, to others, to your family, to other writers. I think that writing groups and people who have the best of intentions can sometimes sidetrack you and shut you down prematurely. So I guess my main advice is keep it close to the vest for a while. Just write. They call it vomit up the first draft, or that messy first draft. That's so important to keep close to yourself. I think we all have mistakes where we've been part of a writer group and you share something with a group and the group doesn't like it for whatever reason, and it can really shut you down. And I had that experience, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. And and I think you can avoid that by not showing stuff too early to people. So my main advice is, please write. Please get it all down on the page. Don't worry about how it looks, how messy it is. You have a lot of time and many drafts ahead of you to winnow it down and allow it to tell you the story you want to tell. That's really what the process is about.
Thank you so much for that. Most writers are also readers. So when you take the time to read just for you, who are your go-to authors and genres?
I laughed when I saw that question on your list of questions, because I read so widely, nonfiction, fiction. So this is how I've decided to answer your question, Sarah. I'm going to read to you the books that I am currently reading. Okay.
Oh, I love it. Okay.
Okay. Here we go. Eula Biss, fantastic nonfiction writer. Having and Being Had is the one I'm reading right now. She's just wonderful. The New Rules of Marriage by Terrence Real. He's an amazing psychotherapist who has a lot of interesting things to say about being an individual versus an us and relationships. So fascinating. I've been married 40 years and I really enjoy reading about relationships. I have Stephen King's on writing, I often dip into him. There's a brand new novel out by Douglas, is that his name? Yeah. He's a Scottish writer. He won the Booker for Shuggie Bain in 2020, which is a really amazing raw novel. And his newest is Young Mungo, which I'm just starting, which looks fantastic. I've got Pema Chodron, American Buddhist nun, on Comfortable with Uncertainty, because God knows I am. Marion Roach Smith, The Memoir Project. You can tell. Here's one that's really interesting. A Primer for Forgetting. Getting Past the Past.
Oh, interesting.
Lewis Hyde. Yeah, really good. Lewis Hyde. This is all talking about how important it is to forget things. Yeah, it's really interesting.
So
and I'll just end by two that I think are really wonderful. Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. That's lovely. And I'm a gardener, so I love reading her stuff. And lastly, this is a hard to find book, but if you can find it, I encourage you to read it. And for memoirists in particular, because she tells this memoir in such an unusual way and uses imagination. This, I think, is the book that got me started in understanding how imaginative you can be in your memoir. And it's called Silvertown by Melanie McGrath, McGrath. It's truly amazing. And she brings you right there. And much of this is told as, you might think it's a novel, but it's a memoir. And I really used a lot of the lessons I learned from that in my own memoir.
How do you, so if you're obviously apparently reading multiple books at once, do you just pick up which one you're in the mood for? Do you have a system? How do you keep them straight?
You know, what I look for and what I really enjoy is the resonance among the books I'm reading, because that's the weird thing that seems to always happen, is a book you might not think has any relationship to some other book in your stack. You'll pick it up suddenly and go, hey, wait a minute. In this novel I'm reading, this very same thing is being talked about by one of the characters in this nonfiction book I just picked up. That's why I do read widely, and, you know, certain things sit in my stack and I don't pick them up for weeks, and I'll pick it up and open it up to where I left off and go, oh, wow, I had no idea I am reading about the same thing elsewhere. So, you can tell I probably have a lot of books lying around my house.
But it's amazing how those connections happen.
Yeah. Again, it's all about that connection and, just sort of being aware of it and intentionally drawing your attention to it. Pema Chodron, the Buddhist nun, she talks about this very cool thing. And I don't meditate. I wish I did. My gardening is my meditation, but I do try to intentionally hear my thoughts. So she talks about, you know, how we all run hamster wheel thoughts through our head. These are the stories we're unconsciously telling ourselves all the time. And as I try to become more conscious of those stories, because they're often negative, I'm not as good enough. I'm unlovable. I'm this, I'm that. Those are the stories I grew up with in my household, thanks to having a pretty abusive mom. And I think a lot of us walk around in the world with this little hamster wheel of negativity. So she talks about trying to surface these stories for yourself by using a feather to touch a bubble and just saying, thinking. If you can surface a story and realize, oh, the hamster wheel's going, and it's by using a feather to touch the bubble of that thought and just noticing it by saying, thinking.
Wow.
And I can do that sometimes, you know, I can just be driving and realize, I am telling one of those stories again to myself, trying to feel bad for whatever reason, thinking. And that just short circuits that just for a moment. And I can realize, okay, here I am driving around on a beautiful day. I'm going to get back home and I'm going to water the garden. Oh, good. Okay. Here I am in the present right now. A lot of good stuff's going on. So
nice. Internet presence, website, any place people can find you on social media, if you could share those.
I am, I'm not very good at social media. I'll just be honest with you. I do have a website, elisabernick.com. Please check that out. There's a lot of good stuff there. If you Google me, you will find my articles that are widely published on writing and traveling and parenting. I'm on Facebook. And yeah, I have friends who throw my stuff up on Instagram. I'm just not that good at it, frankly. Sorry.
Okay. It's not everybody's strong suit.
As my kids would say, sorry, not sorry.
Exactly. See, that's social media right there. Elisa, we've talked about a few different things today, but is there anything we haven't covered that you were hoping to highlight during this time?
So I think you did a good job, Sarah, of covering a lot of territories. And I really appreciate this opportunity. And I hope people pick up the book and enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for not only talking with me today, but sharing your experiences and, letting us kind of into your life in this way, in this memoir.
Thank you. Thank you. I really do appreciate it. This is such a fun process. It was wonderful to write the book. And now, all the conversations and connections I'm making because of it, just are, as I've mentioned, such an added gift to the whole process. So I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you once again to Elisa for joining me to talk about this memoir, to talk about Minnesota, to talk about what it means growing up different in a very homogenous culture, to talk about family and what it means to be part of a family and how those relationships shift and grow and change over the years, and just everything that we talked about. I really enjoyed the conversation. And of course, if you are a fan of memoir, we've had several memoirs lately, which has been really fun. There's always a memoir of someone whose experiences might be similar to yours, or if you want the experiences completely different to yours, of course you can find a memoir discussing those lives. And I just find people's lives fascinating in the first place. So getting to get glimpses of those lives through memoirs is always fun for me. If that is something that you enjoy as well, or if you know someone who loves a good memoir, then you should either get this book for yourself or get it for that family member who loves, or family member, friend, family, random person you meet on the street who loves memoirs. Get the book for you or that other person is all I'm saying. Yeah, go check this book out because it is very well written, a very good read. As always, if you are a fan of this podcast, before I let you go, if you would do a few things for me, I say it all the time, but first you can follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I love hearing from listeners, so come find the podcast on social media. Also, reviews really help to get the podcast out to more listeners. So if you haven't done so already, you can leave a review. That review can be written or it can be starred. Either way, as I said, it helps to get the podcast out to more algorithms, to more listeners like yourselves. And then also, whatever podcast platform you happen to listen to this podcast on, if you're not already following, liking, subscribing, however that works on your platform, you should do so, because then you will always know when there is a new episode out. Usually on Tuesdays, but occasionally there's a second episode on Fridays, and then you will have a notification when new episodes are up. Takes the guesswork out. Hope you're having a great week. I am potentially walking home in the rain, but that will be okay because it's a warm rain. But I hope your week is going well. Whatever you're doing this week, whatever your weather is doing this week, I hope that you have plenty of time for lots and lots of reading. I hope you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.